Today is April 19, 2017, and it is the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So before we begin, let's, as usual, ask our Heavenly Family to really bless us and guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, our Heavenly Family, thank you for loving us. Thank you for giving us such a wonderful feast of truth. Please help us as we continue to study to be able to view things in terms of reality and to learn the lessons that we ought to from that reality. Thank you so much for your principles. Please help us to do all things in love and to honor and glorify you in this meeting. Thank you so much. Guide us, sister. We ask these things, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So, as most of you guys know, or perhaps all of you, we will be reviewing a bit of what we were studying in the earlier portion of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Really, it was the majority of the feast. And that is the Exodus story, according to the various sources, J, E, and P, as pointed out in the documentary hypothesis. So for the sake of people who might listen to this later and might not know what I'm talking about, I'm going to briefly recap the documentary hypothesis and what we have found in our study so far and what we are going to be doing in this study. So, of course, the Passover feast and going into the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a commemoration of the Passover, which is the event which sprung the Exodus movement into motion to leave Egypt and enter into the wilderness and eventually into the promised land. So it is a fitting thing, of course, during the feast to study that event. Well, the primary source that most of us have for studying that event is the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and we have often viewed these first 5 books in the Bible as being written by Moses, and they're called the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah. There are other terms that people use for these books, but traditionally they are viewed as being written by Moses and being an inspired, authoritative account of what took place. About a year ago, we started to ask the questions like, hey, do these books claim to be written by Moses? Were they written by Moses? And so on. And to the first question, we found, no, these books actually do not claim to be written by Moses, which is a little bit surprising for those of us who have grown up with the idea that they were written by Moses. But of course, just simply not claiming to be written by Moses doesn't automatically mean that they were not. And so we had to study that question as well. Well, is there evidence that these writings were written by Moses in spite of the lack of claim? Conversely, is there any evidence that these writings were not written by Moses? And so we went to examine that. And at that point, since they do not make the claim to be written by Moses, and since none of the other books in the Bible claim that those first 5 books were written by Moses, it wasn't so much to study whether or not the Bible or a certain part of the Bible is correct in anything that it says. It's just examining whether the tradition is true. In other words, we recognized that if it turns out that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, that isn't saying anything against Moses, and it isn't saying anything against the Pentateuch, because we have no claim from within the Pentateuch or from any scripture that Moses wrote those first 5 books. And we also have no claim from Moses himself that he wrote those first 5 books. So, of course, if it turns out that Moses didn't write them, well, it can't possibly be against Moses or them, since neither of them make any sort of claim along those lines. So anyway, we examined that question. Is there evidence from within the Pentateuch that would indicate when it was written and by whom? And specifically, if it was written by Moses. And, of course, we examined that. And since there is no claim for it to have been written by Moses from within the text itself, we thought, okay, well, there's nothing at the beginning, nothing at the end, nothing in the middle that claims that. Well, let's look at how it describes Moses. So, of course, the Exodus story and the book of Exodus is where we would naturally look. And what we found is that it describes Moses as the main character of the story at that point, in the same fashion as it described the previous main characters of the story, all the way from Adam to Noah to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. Those are really the primary main characters throughout the Pentateuch, and then Moses is really the main character through the rest of it. There are some other main characters that show up in the lesser sense of main characters, but these are really the main characters throughout the Pentateuch. And all of these characters, again, everyone who's the main character from Adam to Moses, is described biographically as opposed to autobiographically. In other words, you read the story of Moses, and it doesn't say, and I, Moses, did this, and I did that, and so on and so forth. It says, he did this, and he did that. Just like it said with Abraham, he went from this place to this place, and he said this, and he said that, and Joseph said this, and he said that, and etc. This is how all of the main characters are described. There is no difference in how Moses is described as compared to Joseph or Isaac or Jacob or Noah or any of these other characters. And so we really have no more justification for saying that Moses wrote the Pentateuch than we do for saying that Joseph did when we are examining the way the characters are described. Of course, someone might say, oh, well, it's more likely that Moses wrote it because obviously Joseph couldn't have written it because it describes all these events which took place after Joseph. But it only leads us up until the end of Moses' life. So that's why it's more likely that Moses wrote it versus Joseph. But that's not actually quite the case, because the Pentateuch does not describe the events only up to the end of Moses' life. It actually goes slightly beyond that. In fact, the last chapter of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy 34, describes the death and burial of Moses and how there has never been a prophet like unto Moses to arise in Israel up until this very day. Well, of course, that sounds like someone talking about Moses sometime after his death, and in fact, it must be, because it describes his death, and it says how, no one knows the place of his burial up until this day, and he was the meekest man on the earth, and, all these different things about Moses that are clearly post-mortem expressions, and that would be rather odd to come from Moses himself. Also, there are some other things within the Pentateuch that show that it must have been written at a time after the days of Moses. So in Genesis chapter 12, for instance, describing certain events with Abraham, says this happened while there were still Canaanites in the land. Well, if you make a statement that such and such a thing of the past happened while a certain condition persisted, you are automatically implying that that condition no longer persists. So if I today say, and this happened while the modern state of Israel had not been established. Well, I have to say that at a time when the modern state of Israel has been established, to refer to the past and say, while it had not been established. So it's the same sort of thing. If I say, and this happened while the Canaanites were still in the land, well, that implies that I'm writing at a time when Canaanites are no longer in the land. Otherwise, there'd be no point for me to make a statement like that. Interestingly, when Moses was alive, there was no time when he could say, oh, this happened while the Canaanites were still in the land. Why? Because the Canaanites were in the land of Israel during the entirety of Moses' life. Another interesting statement in the book of Genesis, I believe it's in Genesis chapter 36, it says, and such a thing happened before there were any kings in Israel. Well, in order for someone to say before there were kings in Israel, there must have been kings in Israel already by the time they wrote that statement. For instance, if I said, oh, back in 1892, before there were any cell phones in Canada. Well, the only reason why I can make that statement is because now, the time that I'm speaking, there are cell phones in Canada. In other words, I cannot refer to a reality that has not yet happened if it has not even happened in my day. No, I phrased that rather poorly. Let me try and rephrase that. I cannot, while speaking of the past, refer to an event that had not then yet taken place and refer to it as not yet having taken place if it hasn't even taken place in my day. In other words, I'm referring to, I'm looking at the past and saying, hey, at that point, such and such a thing had not happened. Well, such and such a thing must exist in my day, or at least in the past from my day, in order for me to say that it hadn't happened yet. Otherwise, I would have nothing to refer to. I cannot yet say, oh, that happened before flying cars were the norm, because in my day, flying cars are still not yet the norm. So in order for someone to say, this happened before there were kings in Israel, it automatically implies that they made this statement when there were already kings in Israel. Well, kings, that must imply at least two, and so the earliest possible date for the writer of that statement must be in the days of Solomon. That would be the earliest possible date, because that is the earliest time when it can be said that kings reigned in Israel, more than one king. There had to be at least two, and since Solomon was the third king, that's the earliest possible time. Well, obviously, those statements could not have been written by Moses. They must have been written at a later time, hundreds of years after the death of Moses. And so all of that together, we realize that there is no claim from within the Pentateuch and no evidence from within the Pentateuch that Moses actually wrote it. And everything from within the Pentateuch actually indicates that it could not have been written by Moses. So that's the first primary point to keep in mind. The second thing is that there is indication within the Pentateuch that it is not actually one writing by one author at one time. Rather, it was written by multiple separate individuals, originally as separate distinct texts, separate narratives, and then it was combined together. The example that we've been giving is Tatian's Diatessaron. There was a Christian in the 2nd century of the Common Era named Tatian, and he produced a text known as the Diatessaron. The Diatessaron is what is known today as a gospel harmony. Really what it was is a combination of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, into one flowing, coherent text. So Tatian, he took Matthew, and then he took Mark, and he took Luke, and he took John, and he looked at them and said, well, these are all somewhat similar. They describe the life of Jesus, but they're also quite different, and let's see if we can just kind of mesh them all together and splice them together, if you will, into one long coherent text so that we have all the information that each of them provides in one text. And that's what he did. And that writing, the Diatessaron, became very popular in certain areas and among certain groups of Christians. So popular, in fact, that among some groups it became more popular than the Gospels themselves. Theoretically, it's possible that the Diatessaron could have become so popular that it became the dominant Gospel, and that the original Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could have dropped out of circulation. People might have no longer really read them because why copy 4 texts when you could just copy one that has all of the information? If that had happened, people may have forgotten that the Diatessaron was really originally just a combining of 4 originally independent texts. And they may have ended up developing a tradition about who wrote it. So the idea is that that is essentially what has happened with the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible were not originally by one author as one continuous text. And I think it's also important for this discussion to keep in mind that reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy as we have them today, they appear to be one continuous text. In other words, Exodus continues naturally on from the end of Genesis. Leviticus continues naturally on from the end of Exodus. Numbers from Leviticus, and Deuteronomy from Numbers, as though they are one continuous text. However, what we've been learning is that that is only in its present form. It is only like that in its present form. So it's like as if someone took the Diatessaron and split it into 5 books and gave them each different names, but really it's one writing. So the Pentateuch in its present form is really one continuous flowing narrative, but that one continuous text originally was not one continuous text. That text as we have it is a Pentateuch harmony, if you will. It's a harmony of, actually, according to the documentary hypothesis, 4 primary, originally independent narratives. So there are different ways that we know that the Pentateuch was originally separate, independent narratives, and one of the ways is simply the fact that there are several doublets of stories. In other words, the same basic story being told twice. There are 2 stories of Moses getting water from a rock at a place called Meribah, and they're very similar but different. There are 2 stories of Abraham lying about Sarah being his sister. There are 2 stories of God making a covenant with Jacob at Bethel. There are actually around 40 instances of this. 40 stories that are told twice. Well, why is that? Well, historians over the past couple of hundred years have been recognizing that it's rather interesting that in one half of the stories, God is referred to primarily by the name Yahweh, and the other by Elohim, or El. At least up until the days of Moses, then they all refer to God as Yahweh. And if you take all the Yahweh texts throughout Genesis and put them together, they form one continuous flowing narrative. Conversely, if you take the other texts, and actually there are two groups of those texts because sometimes there's triplets, but you read one line of text through and it is one continuous narrative, and another line of text through and it's a continuous narrative. And that really does look like, oh, these were originally independent narratives that were then later brought together in a harmony-type fashion. So there's other evidence for the fact that there's multiple independent authors, but that's the basic idea. And those things are things that we do certainly advocate. We do advocate that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, and that the Pentateuch is a combination of various originally independent texts. The documentary hypothesis goes a step further by explaining how many independent texts there were, when they were written, and generally speaking, at least, by whom. So it asserts that there are four main texts designated as J, E, P, and D. J and E are said to be the earliest of those texts, written sometime between 922 and 722 BC. P, the P text, is understood to have been written sometime likely in the days of Hezekiah, and the D text sometime in the days of Josiah. And then it is understood that either during the Babylonian exile or shortly thereafter, someone combined all four texts together with a few other texts that were, composed a very small percentage of the Pentateuch, and created what we now know as the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. And so we've been studying this throughout this Passover festival, and we've been reading the Exodus story contained in the book of Exodus, chapters 1 to 14. But instead of reading it through, just chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, etc., we have been reading first the J material from Exodus 1 to 14, and then the E material from Exodus 1 to 14, and then, lastly, the P material from Exodus 1 to 14. The reason why it's just those 3 sources rather than the D material as well is because the D material begins in the book of Deuteronomy. So we have read these various texts in order to test the hypothesis and to learn more of the Exodus story, or stories rather, along the way. And in reading the J account, all the J passages from Exodus 1 to 14, we were certainly struck by the beautifully flowing narrative. There's only one place where it didn't flow all that well, but certainly not enough to overthrow the hypothesis, and especially considering that there may be, in the process of editing, some places where the language was either slightly altered or something was left out in order to make it flow properly. But that's not even necessarily the case in order for the J text to flow coherently enough throughout the narrative. And then we read the E text, and it flowed so coherently and so well. And then we read all the P passages also through Exodus 1 to 14. And that takes up pretty well the entirety of those chapters. And it's quite amazing how the text of those first 14 chapters can be divided into 3 separate and independent strands. And when read according to those separate independent strands, each strand is more coherent It makes more sense on its own than when combined with the others. The reason why that's the case is because the texts don't actually agree with each other in all of their details. They tell the story in slightly different ways. And because of that, when they are combined together, there's some tension between verses. Well, wait, why does this verse say that they were tossed into the sea after the sea had returned to its natural state, while another verse says that there was walls of water on either side of this dry path in the midst of the sea, and Pharaoh's army was in the middle of the sea, and it collapsed onto them from both sides? Well, that's a little bit confusing for it to say both. And the Pentateuch, as we have it, does say both. But when these texts are separated into their independent strands, then one story says it one way and the other story says it another way, and each story makes sense self-contained, as in each story on its own is a consistent narrative, whereas the combined version, as we presently have it, has a fair amount of inconsistencies. All that said, when we do have them separated, they do tell the same basic story, but there is a lot of difference. And one might wonder, what do we do with these differences? It's the same situation that we are in with the Gospels in the New Testament, which have quite a number of significant differences. Recently, we read through the resurrection accounts in all four canonical Gospels, if you will, and they are quite different from each other. People often combine them, at least mentally, but read on their own, each Gospel has a different story to tell. And it's the same thing with these sources of the Pentateuch. But we want to find out what they have to say, each on their own, because that is the only way that the integrity of each author can be preserved. With the Gospels in the New Testament, we should want to know what Mark has to say as independent from the others. You want to know, how does this author really want to tell their story? Just like if I wrote a story, if I wrote the history of the Davidian movement, and then someone else wrote their own history of the Davidian movement, and another person, and let's say you have 4 authors writing the history of the Davidian movement. Well, while I would be writing my history, I would certainly write it from my perspective. I would try to get across certain points, and I would have an overall message that I want to convey by telling that history. And that won't be precisely the same as another person's telling of the same story. And so if someone was to then take my writing and combine it with that of 2 or 3 others, well then the way that I wanted to tell the story in the combined version becomes lost. And the message that I wanted to get across becomes lost. And the same would be true of all the other authors. And that was kind of the problem with Tatian's Diatessaron. The actual message of each independent gospel writer became obscured. And that's what has happened with the sources of the Pentateuch as well. Each individual voice has been obscured. So far, in our study, the documentary hypothesis has stood the test. There does seem to be a discernible J source, a discernible E source, and a discernible P source. And we really do want, if those sources really are actual, original, independent sources, we want J to be able to speak on its own. We want to hear the voice of that author. We want E to speak on its own and to hear the voice of that author. And the same for P. And so while we went through those stories, we took notes on the order of the events as described in each source as independent from the others. And so Teresa took those notes down as we went, and then this evening, a little bit before the call, I put them together quickly in a PDF into 3 columns so we could read them side by side. And I was a bit rushed in doing so, and so they're not as nicely formatted as I would like, but at least we have them there. And if you'll notice, the middle column has the greatest number of points, and because of that, I had to actually decrease the font size a little bit. So sorry if the font is a little bit small. And also I had to take out the numbers. Originally they were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And I had to take them out in order to get the format to be okay, because for some reason it kept on inserting a space between the number and the beginning of the words following each number, and it just took up too much space. So we had to have it in its present format, and maybe in the future we'll have something better. But anyway, this gives us the idea.
If someone else wants to make a better format and share it with us, that'd be great.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're all free to play around with that and send something out. Or at least send it to us. This isn't something that we sent to everyone on our email list, just because not everyone is necessarily prepared to study the documentary hypothesis. But we sent it to those who were on the call last night. And, so we'll see exactly how far-reaching these studies end up going. But anyway, we have the narratives there in 3 columns side by side, so that we can kind of compare them at least more easily than if they weren't side by side. So that's our goal for tonight's study, to look through and compare these stories to see their similarities and their differences. Before we do that, does anyone have any comments or questions? Okay, well, it doesn't sound like there are any comments or questions. Let me ask you guys a question then. Can you hear us?
Sure. Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. I just thought I'd check since there was no response. Always good to have that clear. All right, well, I take it that at least many of you guys have the file pulled up and are ready to compare. So let's start. First thing that I want to point out is that in the 3rd column, the P column, we started earlier in the story. We went further back into Genesis 48 or 49. I don't remember for sure. But we went further back just to get the flow of the text a little bit better. So if it appears like, oh, well, each of these texts starts at a different point, and that's a difference, that's not really the case. It's just that we went further back. All 3 of these texts go further back. So none of these texts start with the death of Joseph or the death of Jacob or anything like that. J starts with a telling of the creation of the world in Genesis 2. P starts with a telling of the creation of the world in Genesis 1. And E, we don't really know exactly how E starts. If E did have a creation account, it was dropped out of the combined version of the Pentateuch, whether that was when it was combined to its present form, or whether it was dropped out in the combination of J and E into RJE, which combination according to the documentary hypothesis, took place before the writing of P and D. So anyway, throughout the kind of the way that we're going to be talking about this, we're going to speak of the documentary hypothesis as a working hypothesis, because so far it is a working hypothesis. It works, it's made sense, and so on. Although, as we've said in our previous studies, it requires more study than we've had in order to determine that the documentary hypothesis, as presented by scholars, is actually certainly correct. I mean, I think it'd be wise for us to at least read the whole Pentateuch according to the sources before coming to a conclusion on that, because Exodus 1-14 is a relatively small portion of the entirety of the Pentateuch. And of course, that didn't even touch on the D source. So we haven't really studied enough to be able to confirm the hypothesis as a whole. Although, if it isn't true, something very much like it must be. So I just checked, and the place where the earliest E source passage is in the Pentateuch, from what I'm able to tell, is in Exodus 20. So either there's a lot missing from P, or it starts in Exodus 20. Okay. So looking at the P source, so this is the column furthest to the right in our PDF, I want to just quickly start there and get up to the point of the other two sources. So, of course, the order of things in P, it describes the death of Jacob and then the burial of Jacob. And then the children of Israel multiply and become powerful. Okay, so it actually does not describe the death of Joseph, but it talks about the multiplying of the children of Israel. So, death of Jacob, burial of Jacob, multiplying of the children of Israel. Well, let's look now at the J source. It has the death of Joseph and his brothers. The E source just mentions the death of Joseph. It doesn't mention the death of the brothers. And then in the J source, the next event is Pharaoh's decree to kill the sons, the children of Israel, and particularly the males. Well, that's kind of interesting that it doesn't mention the multiplying of the children of Israel. That's not in J. It is in P, as we just read, and it's also in E. E has Joseph died, a new Pharaoh arises in Egypt, and then he complains about the multiplying of Israel. So you can see how some of these sources have something in common, and then there's some elements that are missing in one but present in another. So we're going to try and go through each aspect, or go through each source, and try and kind of keep them going through the story at the same time together. How does that sound to you guys?
That's good. I would kind of like to sneak in a question here. I've been meaning to ask.
Sure.
Hope it doesn't sound too foolish. As far as I know, we haven't discussed it, but it's very possible I've missed it or something. So we've got all these different sources, and as far as I'm concerned, even though 3 or 4 people have seen the same wreck and they see it from different angles, they see it slightly different, it's still a car accident, and you would think some of it would, most of it would drive pretty close. But in some of these instances here, like you say, there's nothing mentioned at all, and they're quite different. In fact, like the chariots supposedly going down into the dry seabed and then the water coming over them versus just being tossed in there. Okay, so having mentioned that, my question is, are we told anywhere, even in this book that Friedman wrote, put all this together, are we told when the writers lived? Are they? Is this Pentateuch supposed to have been written by eyewitnesses or not? Or is it written by someone who heard something and that person heard it from this person and that person? Could that be why it's so different? So did I say that okay?
Yes, I believe your question. Yeah, I believe that your question is well stated. And yeah, we have talked about a bit the dating of each source according to the documentary hypothesis. So J and E are supposed to be the earliest sources written in the time of the divided kingdom between 922 BC and 722 BC. And then the P source written sometime in the days of Hezekiah, and the D source written in the days of Josiah. So that's kind of the date range. So 922 to 722. Okay, well that's over 400 years after when the Exodus is traditionally dated. So that would say that our earliest two sources, J and E, were written sometime at least 400 years after the Exodus. That's, the general idea. And then Hezekiah, if I'm remembering right, I think it was in the 8th century BCE, 700-something, or even going into the 7th century, 600-something. So that's moving ahead quite a bit further away from the Exodus. And then the D source, that's even longer after the Exodus, if it's in the days of Josiah, in the 600s. So that's, we're talking about things written between 400 and 800 years after the event. Also, according to the documentary hypothesis, the P writer was not independent of J.E., the combined J.E. Writing. So again, the idea is that after 722, J and E were combined, but it was just J.E. combined. The others weren't even written yet. And then whoever wrote the P source was aware of this combined J.E. and wrote the P source as an alternative history to that. So it's not like it's an independent witness necessarily. Although with some things it can be if it is relying on older sources that are not the same sources as J and E. So that's possible. And same with the D. D would be written at a time when J, E, and P are already in existence, and presumably the author or authors of the D source would be aware of the other writings. J and E, though, presumably are actually independent accounts, but again, written a long time after the events they describe, even with the more recent events that they describe, like the Exodus. Of course, this is all written much, much after the days of Abraham and Noah and Adam and all of that. Like, this is a long time after all of that. And so sometimes people, in finding out that, these sources were written much later, then all of a sudden we feel less sure, like, oh no, now if this is all just dependent on oral traditions going back, that's less reliable. And perhaps it is. But I do want to point out that even if the Pentateuch was written by Moses, well, then you still have this long period of oral tradition before he wrote what he did. So, in a sense, it's the same circumstance, just pushed back to a different time. So, none of the sources of the Pentateuch either claim to be eyewitnesses of the events they describe or are eyewitnesses of the events they describe. None of this, like the J source and the E source and the P source, are not different eyewitness testimonies as to the Exodus event. Talking about eyewitness testimonies and the differences that you might get does turn out to be a useful illustration to describe certain aspects of the differences between these sources. Yet, it is quite a different circumstance in that these are not eyewitness accounts. They both deal with different traditions of oral history. So, the documentary hypothesis states that the J source was written in the southern kingdom. And so, and the E source written in the northern kingdom. So the idea is that in the south, people were telling these stories of the creation and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs and Moses and all of that. And they came to understand those stories in different ways and tell it in different ways. And those in the north told those same basic stories, but in different ways than those in the south. The stories developed differently in each respective location, and thus they share certain things, but then they are also different. And then the priests, of whom one of them at least was the author of the priestly source, may have had different oral traditions and maybe even different documents with history, possibly. But, you know, they represent different traditions that are concerning the same points of history. So, yeah, it's perhaps not quite as helpful as eyewitness events, but even eyewitness events aren't always the most helpful. But we can still compare them in a similar way to how eyewitness testimonies would be compared. And if you can see them disagreeing on certain points, but then there are certain main things that they agree on, those main things are more likely to actually be grounded in history. But I'm not saying that everything that they agree on must be historically true. And I'm not saying that everything that they disagree on is unreliable historically. But their disagreements and agreements are one avenue of determining what actually did happen. But anyway, that's a very good question. Did you find my answer helpful, or do you have further questions in relation to it?
Yeah, I'm glad I heard it again, because most of what you said I remembered. It was coming back to me about hundreds of years later. I remember that when you said it. And but, you know, that's a lot. I mean, even 400 years later is a long time. Look at our country, the United States. It's, you know, around 200 years old. And the stories that change in the telling just in 200 years is major. Anyway, it's just a interesting concept that there is so many here, and I'm just kind of looking forward to see where it leads, and looking forward to my book when it gets here so I can look it over a little bit closer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it makes a person feel like, you know, how could all that be inspired? Because God wouldn't have had everybody write things down differently. In my way of thinking, I wouldn't think so. So it's it is confusing, and yet it's interesting as well. And it's very understandable how the stories could change depending on how many years later it was and how many tellings. So I think that's what we're looking at here, right?
Yeah, in many ways. And, I can see how it would be confusing to think, oh, well, why would God have them write history in different ways and all of that? But, again, so far as we know, these sources don't claim to be inspired by God. And so, when we consider, it's kind of like, we wouldn't expect that every historian telling American history would say the same things or that they would agree all the time. In fact, historians actually disagree about a lot. They argue different cases for things happening in different ways and all of that. And if that's the case for American history, which all took place at a time when there's better record keeping than in the ancient world, then certainly we would expect it to be the case in the ancient world, including among the ancient Israelites. We would expect that there would be different tellings of similar stories that would disagree on points and agree on other points, and that, that would just be part of, in a sense, the heritage of the people. And you'd expect that among practically every culture. So
it shows our way of thinking about the Bible as a canon, and that everything in it is inspired. And I'm with, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Thinking, okay, wait a second, isn't this all inspired? Well, then why are they different? And it's like, well, maybe some of them aren't inspired. Maybe none of them are inspired, because none of them even claim that. And, okay, well, that's different. What do I do with that? And, so, yeah, all of this is still, I think, vestiges of canonical thinking.
Sure. Oh, yeah. And that's totally understandable. And also, even though, like you said, Mom, when I was mentioning these things, you were remembering, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. But seriously, we've been learning a whole bunch of stuff, and it's to be expected. We should all expect of ourselves, in a sense, that we're not going to remember everything, and we're going to have to go over it multiple times and all of that to
why these reviews are good for all of us, not just for someone listening who hasn't heard the other studies.
Yeah, it's true. So
yeah, I'm glad it all got mentioned again too. I'm not going to remember the exact years, but I'll definitely be remembering that it was way down the line. Although, Jesus did make reference to what scriptures were available in his day, so I'm assuming that the ones he made reference to would have been inspired writings. That would be a logical statement, do you think?
Well, it depends what you mean by made reference to. I'm sure Jesus made reference to plenty of writings that, for different reasons. And again, in Jesus' day, the whole concept of Scripture and the whole concept of the Bible, well, first of all, they didn't have really a concept of the Bible. No one was really thinking to finalize any sort of list of writings that are the writings and stuff like that. They didn't have this idea of inspiration that people have today where they think, oh, well, this is just, word for word spoken by God exactly as given and so on and so forth. So I'm sure he made use of writings that he didn't consider to be inspired. As we have it in the Gospels, he certainly quotes Genesis, and the version of Genesis that he had was combined. It was the combined Genesis. He may not have known that it was written by separate independent people. He may have thought that all of the Pentateuch was written by one author.
Oh, see, that brings me to another point that I was going to mention. We think of Jesus as knowing everything that he knew prior to his incarnation when he was human. You want to say something, Mom?
I'm going like, yeah, that's right. That's why. That's the reason. And that's really interesting. To bring all that out too, because he was human, and so he could. Yeah, I'm not going to say any more, but I understand what you're saying.
Sure, and I'll even take this a step further. Often, it's so easy for us because of canonical thinking to think that different rules apply with modern prophets, but ancient prophets went by different rules. Ancient prophets must be more right in a sense.
They're more inspired.
Yeah, in a way. So we look at like Ellen White, and she even she totally believed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And there's a place where she talks about how he wrote the book of Genesis while in the wilderness, and then other books written later and so on. Of course, she didn't originate those ideas, but that's what she thought, and that's what she repeated. And yet, today we can look and understand, she was going with the common understanding of her day. But then, if there was an ancient prophet who thought Moses wrote the Pentateuch, then either that prophet was wrong or the Pentateuch must have been written by Moses, But what I'll say is this: I don't know of any evidence that any ancient prophets thought that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. There are, of course, places in the New Testament where the law of Moses is quoted from the Pentateuch. And I think that there's one place in Luke that has Jesus saying something about Moses wrote, and then it's something from the Pentateuch that he quotes that's not just from the law of Moses. Because again, the Pentateuch, while it wasn't written by Moses, I do believe that it contains within it some things that probably were written by Moses. Like Deuteronomy quotes something that Moses wrote, and there are places in the Pentateuch that say, and Moses wrote the following words or whatever, and then quotes. So there are times when Jesus and New Testament authors quote from the law of Moses as contained in the Pentateuch, and that's okay. But I think that there's one place in Luke that has Jesus saying, and Moses wrote something, and then it just quotes from like Genesis or something, not something that is attributed to Moses from within the Pentateuch itself. And so that might come across as evidence that Jesus believed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. But there's some complications with that, because in Mark's version, for example, of that same saying, Jesus doesn't say Moses wrote this. He says something like Moses said it, or I forget. I'd have to go back into the details. But in one gospel, it could be taken as Jesus believing that Moses did write the Pentateuch, and in another, it could be taken like that's not even what would be implied at all. And of course, the earlier of the two is the one where it wouldn't even be implied at all. But that's just one thing that possibly, that's the only one possible thing that I know of that could be taken as a belief in a Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. But even that, even if Jesus believed that Moses wrote one portion, isn't evidence that he thought that he wrote the whole thing. And we don't even have any solid evidence that at all that Jesus thought that Moses wrote like Genesis or Exodus or like some distinct portion of the combined Pentateuch. But if he did, wouldn't mean that Moses did write it.
Hey, Trent, is it likely, it's probably not likely, that there's any books that Moses actually did write that are lost?
Yeah, I actually I don't find that unlikely at all. The Pentateuch talks about Moses writing things, and it quotes things that apparently he wrote. We've talked about how in basically in the days of Josiah, there was a lost book of the law that was found that was supposed to be the law of Moses, and it was a very ancient scroll. Richard Elliott Friedman, I think in Who Wrote the Bible, he talks about that a bit. He doesn't say how old he thinks that scroll was, but he considers it to be very ancient. And so it's possible, of course, that Moses did write some things like, I really, we have multiple witnesses to the idea that Moses wrote certain things, and some of them may be preserved in the Pentateuch. Others of them may still be lost. There is an obscure group of Jews from before the time of Jesus known as something like the Nestorians. It's a name very similar to the Nazarenes, and some people think that there's a connection. I don't know if there is. But there's this group of Jews from before the time of Jesus, and they basically rejected the Pentateuch as being the law of Moses. They said that Moses didn't write it, but they had other books that they said were genuine books written by Moses. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know if those books are preserved at all. But that's one thing. And then we do have other, like in ancient writings, there are people who quote things. Like there's something called the Book of the Covenant that is presumably the covenant made through Moses. And that's quoted, but we don't have any of the book, but we have some quotes from it in other writings. And then there are other books of Moses that are quoted from that are no longer preserved, or at least books that people thought were written by Moses. And then there's the Temple Scroll, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there's a large section of it that is not too fragmentary, but some of it is pretty fragmentary. And there's a section where, Yahweh is speaking and says, and your brother Aaron. And it, really seems like it's speaking to Moses. And it's given, like the way the Temple Scroll is written, is as though it is a revelation directly from Yahweh to Moses. And, is it that could be actually a writing of Moses, and maybe it was one of the sources behind the Pentateuch? People can study that, and I think that would be good to study. Definitely the Temple Scroll is something that should be examined to see if it might actually be a genuine Mosaic document. I don't know if it is, but it's worthy of consideration.
Thank you.
So are there any other comments or questions? All right, perhaps not. In going through to compare these, it might be kind of hard to go back and forth and to talk. So what I'm thinking is maybe we'll pull it up, and maybe I'll just go through and vocally compare them. And then if anyone has any comments as we're going, just say, I have a comment, or something like that. You can just let me know that you have a comment. But it seems like kind of, since it's a little bit more of a complicated thing, trying to compare 3 columns of things, it might just make the most sense for me to speak about it, and then you guys interrupt if you have a comment. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yep.
That's good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we have J and E that describe the death of Joseph. P doesn't. P goes right from the death and burial of Jacob to the multiplying of the children of Israel. E has also the multiplying of the children of Israel, but it's set as a complaint of the new Pharaoh who arose after Joseph died, and he's complaining about how Israel is multiplying. In the J story, we don't have any of that talk of the multiplying. It goes right into a Pharaoh decreeing to kill the sons of Israel. An interesting thing that I want to point out with all of the sources, none of them mention which Pharaoh. And this is something that drives historians and archaeologists crazy, because it's like, man, just saying Pharaoh could be anyone at any period of time. It's so, like, there's so many pharaohs over such a vast period of time. Saying just simply Pharaoh is really kind of odd.
Makes me think that they didn't know.
Right, exactly. That's what a lot of historians conclude, that the sources of the Pentateuch just didn't know which Pharaoh it was. Other historians view it kind of differently. Other historians think that they're just saying Pharaoh because they're trying to just designate the office. But really, it was multiple pharaohs over a larger period of time. And, you know, those who argue for that position take some strength to their position from archaeology, since the archaeological evidence for the Exodus, well, I'll put it like this. When it comes to the Exodus and archaeology, some archaeologists think that there's zero evidence for anything at all like it. A few, but very few, think that there is evidence for the Exodus as described in the Pentateuch as we have it. And the greater majority are somewhere in the middle. When you look at the Egyptian references to Canaanites or Asiatics or what would be like Israelites in Egypt, it's scattered over a large period of time. If you look at things that are similar to like Joseph, perhaps, like a Semitic ruler and stuff like that, I mean, there are some things that are quite strikingly similar to various elements of the Exodus story. But it's scattered over a long period of time. And it's not like just this one big event like we're used to hearing about it. So I don't really know exactly what the truth is of all of those events and how archaeology factors in. But there was a big Exodus conference with, I think, like 40 experts in archaeology and the text of the Hebrew Bible and all of that, including Richard Elliott Friedman, including William Dever, and a whole bunch of different people who are like experts in the field. And they gathered together and had this big Exodus conference. And like there's like 40 talks given, and it was all videotaped, and it's available online for free. So maybe after the meeting, I'll pull up the link and post it somewhere online for you guys to be able to see. Because I think that that'd be a good way to go if we want to get to like the history of what actually happened. This sure is included, but that I think would be a valuable route to go to see what different archaeologists, different specialists who have different opinions, what they think about all of this. And there's even question and answer periods where their colleagues are questioning them on their presentation. So I have by no means watched all of that. I've only seen a few of them, but what I did see was quite interesting. So anyway, in these various narratives, let's see what the next event is. So in P, it talks about after the multiplying of the children of Israel, Egypt makes the Israelites serve with harshness. E has something similar because the next thing is the setting of taskmasters over the Israelites. So those, while there's no taskmasters specifically mentioned in P or in J, P does have something similar, being, made to serve with harshness. Whereas in J, it doesn't actually mention taskmasters or serving in hardness. It goes right to the birth of Moses next. In the P story, it doesn't talk about the birth of Moses. It goes from Egypt making the Israelites serve with harshness to Israel groaning and God remembering the covenant. And then the next thing is God speaking with Moses and revealing the name Yahweh. In the E text, after it describes the taskmasters being set over the Israelites, then you have the Pharaoh commanding the midwives to kill the male newborns. But in E, the midwives don't kill the newborns. Whereas in the J text, you have this decree to kill the sons, and the sons being killed. But in the E text, it also does not describe the birth of Moses. It starts out with Moses shepherding the flock of Jethro in Midian. The J text does talk about a priest of Midian, but it doesn't call him Jethro. It calls him Ruel. And we don't actually have that in the J column here, but you guys can read it in Exodus. So in J, we have the birth of Moses, and he's hid, and he's adopted, and then by the way, in none of these stories does Moses not know who he is growing up, and then he later finds out he's a Hebrew. That's just the movie. Just to get that one straight. That's just the movie. And also the whole thing with being the brother of Ramses and all of that. That's just the movie. That's not in any of the Pentateuch sources. And in fact, it doesn't mention Ramses other than the place. So, anyway, after Moses is born, hid, and adopted, then you have in J, Moses killing the Egyptian and fleeing to the land of Midian. And he marries a wife, Zipporah, who's the daughter of Ruel. And with her he has a son named Gershom. And then Pharaoh dies, and then Moses is at the burning bush. And Yahweh tells him that he will deliver the Israelites. So it kind of gets to the call of Moses at that point. Whereas in the E text, Moses was shepherding in Midian. Doesn't say why, when he got there, how he got there, his prehistory up to that point. And then it goes into how he came to the mountain of God, Horeb. And then he is called by God. And God identifies himself, telling him the name Yahweh for the first time in the E text. And God takes note of the oppression of Israel and tells Moses to go speak to Pharaoh. And Yahweh gives him signs and appoints Aaron to be with Moses. And then Moses left for Egypt. Let's see if we have to catch up now in the P text. So the P text, after the revelation of the name Yahweh, Yahweh assures Moses that he will keep the covenant, that he will take the children of Israel, and he will be their God, and bring them out of the land of Egypt. And then the next thing it actually has Moses speaking to the children of Israel. So the P text is actually kind of going through the story faster and giving less detail. But, yeah, it has Moses there in Egypt then, and it doesn't actually in the P text have him outside of Egypt at any point here so far. Although if I remember at some point it says to go back to Egypt, implying that he wasn't there at some point. Going back to the E text, let's catch up to him leaving for Egypt. I guess that's the next thing in the E text that we haven't gone over yet. So after Yahweh says, hey, look, Aaron will be with you, then Moses leaves for Egypt. In the J text, after, Moses, when he went to Egypt, he took his wife and son with him. That's not in the other texts, but he did in the J text. And on their way, they stop at a lodging place, and Zipporah circumcises their son, although it describes it a little bit more crudely than that. She cuts off his foreskin anyway. And then evidently they continue on. And Moses and Aaron then go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Pharaoh refuses, and then the next thing is Israel is walking out of Egypt with that cloud and pillar of fire, and Pharaoh learns that they fled. And the fact that it says Pharaoh learns that they fled does imply that in the J story, there wasn't like negotiations with Pharaoh and then he finally says, okay, go. In the J story, it doesn't actually record anything like that. Of course, there is a possible gap between Pharaoh refusing and Israel going, because the language doesn't flow that well between those 2 points. But there may have just been a small phrase that was taken out to make it work. Like, after Pharaoh refused, then Moses gathered the children of Israel and they left. And there was a cloud with them. It could have been something as simple as that. It could have been a sentence or part of a sentence. Or maybe it was just like this. Maybe the J author wanted it to just immediately go into, hey, now they're leaving. So this is really interesting because in the J text, as we have it, there is no Passover. There is no plagues. It's simply, let's get out of here, and they leave.
Yeah, that's real interesting.
Yeah, very, very interesting. In the other two sources, E and P, there is actually plagues. So let's go back to E. So after Moses left for Egypt, Moses and Aaron gather the children of Israel and show them the signs that God had given to Moses. The people believed, and the people want to go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness. If I remember right, this is only in the E text. They want to go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness to keep a feast. And then Pharaoh increases their work, restricts their straw, but Yahweh promises to deliver Israel. And then you come to the plagues. But before we read them, let's go to the P source and find out what takes place leading up to the plagues. So, after Yahweh assured Moses that he'll deliver the children of Israel, and Moses spoke to the children of Israel, it says, but they did not listen to Moses because of shortness of spirit and because of hard work. Now, this is really interesting because in the E story, when Moses and Aaron first gather the children of Israel and show them the signs and speak to them, it says the people believed. But in the P text, Moses spoke to the children of Israel and they did not listen to Moses. So then Yahweh tells Moses to go and speak to Pharaoh so that he should let Israel go. But Moses objects because of his uncircumcised lips. So he's like, hey, look, the children of Israel didn't listen to me. I'm not doing this well. He's kind of having less success and really a harder time. He's more stumbling and all of that, which fits what the documentary hypothesis says about the P source. It kind of almost degrades Moses and uplifts Aaron, according to the documentary hypothesis. And in fact, there's been a long debate over what it means when Moses came down from Sinai and his face was different. Well, there's the words in Hebrew there, people have really not known for a long time how to translate them. So have you guys ever seen medieval art of Moses and saw how it portrays him with horns?
Yes.
Yeah. The reason why is because that's one way to translate the Hebrew of that passage where Moses comes down and his face is different, and one way to translate that is that he had horns. Another way is that his face was shining and he had beams of light coming from his face.
What did you say before that? One way of translating that is what?
That he had horns.
Horns. Okay.
Like a goat has horns and a ram has horns.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that's one way that he had horns. Another way is he had beams of light. Someone, I think his name is William Prop, and he is one of the people who really is into the documentary hypothesis. And the way that he translates it, he argues that it is saying that he was actually disfigured. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, I think that's interesting text anyway. So what happens in the P source after Moses objects is that Yahweh assures Moses that he will be able to speak to Pharaoh and that he has sent Aaron to be with Moses to be his prophet. So Aaron is kind of like the hero. He's the one who's like, hey, don't worry, I know you're stumbling through this, but Aaron's going to be there. Pharaoh won't listen, but Yahweh will deliver his people anyway. So that's what's portrayed. And then Moses and Aaron did what Yahweh commanded, and it gives the ages of Moses and Aaron. And then it comes to the miracles. So our calling card is about to go out, and when we come back, then we will compare the plagues between the E source and the P source. So we'll be back in just a minute. Okay, we are now back. So to compare now the P source and the E source on the plagues. Again, J doesn't have anything like this at all. So let's look at E, since apparently it was the earlier version. So the first plague, I'll say first, what took place before this is that Yahweh promises to deliver Israel. And then there is turning the Nile to blood, the plague of frogs, the insect swarm, plague on Egyptian livestock, plague of hail, and then it describes Yahweh making the hearts of Pharaoh and his servants heavy. And then there's the plague of locusts, the plague of darkness, and then there is Moses and Pharaoh argue about whether they'll let the people go. And then Yahweh says he will bring one more plague upon Egypt, the slaying
of the firstborn. So let's just count those quick. Okay, so first, Nile, that's 1. Frogs, that's 2. Insects, that's 3. Livestock, that's 4. Hail, that's 5. Locusts, that's 6. Darkness, that's 7. One more plague, that's 8. The death of the firstborn in the E-text is the 8th plague. So that's interesting to take note of. Now let's look at the circumstances in the P-text. So first, there is the miracle of the staff becoming a serpent. And of course, you have the serpent of Moses or Aaron. We'd have to check to see if it's Aaron's staff. I think it's Aaron's staff.
I think it's Aaron's
yes,
staff.
Yes, it is. That's right, because in P, all of the events that have magicians, there's Aaron doing things with his staff. So the staff becomes a serpent. Let's not count that as a plague. I don't think it's a plague.
Mm-mm.
So the first plague is the blood. And let's see, that was the first one also in E. The next one is the frogs.
I'll look at E, you look at P.
Okay, so you just tell me if there's something different.
Mm-hmm.
So the next one is the frogs. The next one is the lice.
Mine says insects.
Yeah, insect plague. So lice, insect.
Well, the flies is what's missing. It says insect swarm plague, and then this one, unless, is that what they're calling?
It might be that the insects is translated flies in the King James, something like that.
Okay.
So anyways, so the first one is the blood, next is the frogs, then is the lice, fourth is the boils.
There's no boils in E.
No boils in E. It's the livestock plague.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in P, after the boils, the next thing is the instructions for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then the plague of the destroyer, which is the death of the firstborn. So that's the 5th plague in the P source.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. That's the 5th plague, and there's instructions for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that are quite detailed in P. And then there's, this plague of the death of the firstborn. And then in P, the children of Israel followed the instructions for Passover. And then there's an explanation of the duration of living in Egypt. It talks about the 430-year period. And there's further Passover instructions. And then Yahweh instructs Moses to bring the children of Israel into the wilderness.
So P doesn't have the plague of locusts. And it doesn't have the livestock.
Or the darkness.
What about hail? No hail.
No hail either. Yeah. Okay, so in P, that's going into the wilderness. In E, after the death of the firstborn, Pharaoh lets the children of Israel go, and he drives them out. It looks like that's only in E. And then Moses calls the elders together, instructs them to sacrifice the Passover lamb, put the blood on the doorposts, and then in the middle of the night, Yahweh strikes the firstborn of Egypt. That's the plague of death. And then Pharaoh tells the Israelites to get up and leave Egypt. The Israelites leave, taking with them unleavened bread and Egyptian spoils. And Yahweh commands Moses to consecrate every firstborn. There's a command to keep the annual Feast of Unleavened Bread in the first month. And then there's specifications for giving the firstborn. And then God leads the people by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. So goes and takes them into the wilderness, and they take Joseph's bones with them, as Joseph had asked them to do earlier in the E text. So that's all of the sources now in our review of them are at the point of going into the wilderness. The way it's put in J is that they go with, being led by the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Pharaoh learns that they fled and then chases them. And the Israelites were afraid. But Moses told them not to be afraid, and he promised salvation. Okay, so that's how it is in J. In E, they go off into the wilderness by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And then they take Joseph's bones with them, and the Egyptians go after the Israelites. And the Israelites complain and would rather serve Egypt.
That had to be a pretty big deal to get Joseph's bones.
Yeah, you'd think so. But at the same time, in the E-text, Pharaoh is really like, all right, guys, leave, and they get to take the spoils with them and all of that.
Yeah.
So Israel, or Egypt, is a lot more cooperative in the E-text.
Right.
And then in P, the way it happens is that after the final Passover instructions that it gives, Yahweh instructs Moses to bring the children of Israel into the wilderness. And then Yahweh hardens Pharaoh's heart, and the Egyptian army goes after them. And then the Israelites cry out to Yahweh. So now in all the three stories, we have the children of Israel in the wilderness being pursued by the Egyptians. In J, they're chasing them because they fled. And evidently they never had permission to leave, so they're going after them. In E, they're going after them even though they had permitted them to leave. They ended up going after them anyway, and it doesn't really explain why.
Well, we didn't take a note of it, at least. I don't remember which one. Maybe it's E, where he's like, what was I thinking?
Yeah, you're right. It was something like that. He changed his mind.
Yeah, so E or P.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was E.
Yeah.
And then P, the reason why Pharaoh goes after is because Yahweh hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Mm-hmm.
So now the Israelites are being chased by the Egyptians. What happens? Well, let's start with J. With J, the cloud moved between the two camps. Now remember, the cloud and the pillar is not in any of the other sources. It's only in J. So it moves between the two camps. It's dark on the Egyptian side and light on the Israelite side. And then Yahweh drives back the sea, and the Israelites go through, and then the sea is returned to its normal state. And then Yahweh throws the camp of the Egyptians into a tumult and then tosses them into the sea. And the way it's translated in this is tosses them into the sea. So it's really, that's how it's dealt with then. And then, hey, they made it through to the other side of the sea, and it's all good. So that's how the pursuing Egyptians are dealt with in J. Just to keep that straight, again, there's a pillar of cloud that comes between them and stops the Egyptians from getting to them. And then Yahweh drives back the sea. The children of Israel go through. The sea returns to its normal state. And then the Egyptians are thrown into a tumult and tossed into the sea. And it says that the children of Israel see them dead on the shore. Okay, now let's go to the E text and see how this is dealt with. So the Egyptians are going after the Israelites. What happens? The Israelites complain, and they would rather serve Egypt. And then an angel comes between the Israelites and the Egyptians. and does something to the chariot wheels, whether it's removing the chariot wheels or twisting them. The different translations have it differently, but does something to the chariot wheels so that the Egyptians are prevented from overtaking them. They're slowed down, that they just can't catch up to them. So notice, in the E-text, there is no Red Sea crossing at all. They go by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. So the wilderness is called the wilderness of the Red Sea, but it doesn't say that they actually go to the Red Sea itself. It doesn't say that they even see the Red Sea. It doesn't say that they cross it. It doesn't say that the children of Israel are drowned in it. It doesn't say that the Egyptians are drowned in it. It doesn't say that they interact with it at all. The Red Sea itself is not mentioned, just the wilderness of the Red Sea. The way that they are saved from the pursuing Egyptians is that an angel comes and messes the wheels of the chariots so that they either fall off or whatever. It doesn't even describe the Egyptians dying. It just describes them not able to get to the Israelites. So presumably if their wheels were knocked off, well, it would be too late by the time they get everything back together. And then basically it's like, all right, may as well go home. So that's very, very different from the J story. Now how about the P story? In the P story, the Egyptian army caught up with Israel, and then the Israelites cry out to Yahweh, and then the Red Sea is split, or at least the sea. I forget if it says the Red Sea or not, but the sea is split, making a wall of water on either side, and Israel goes through. The Egyptian army pursues them. So here there's no angel. Here there's no cloud. It's just they're going forward. The sea splits. And I'm pretty sure it was Moses' staff. He took his staff, raised it. The sea split. The children of Israel go through. They get to the other side. And the Egyptians are pursuing them. And they're in this path through the midst of the sea with a wall of water on either side. And then Moses raises his rod again, and the sea, the waters of the sea went back and destroyed Pharaoh's army. Obviously, they're dead in the bottom of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how the P narrative ends. So that's the Exodus story in all three sources.
I just want to be reminded, the E source is reportedly written by someone in the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom after the split of Israel.
Yes.
And the J source was reportedly written by someone in the southern kingdom. Interesting to keep in mind, since the northern kingdom was apostate. And then the P source was it written by a priest, or that's the consensus?
That's the idea. In fact, the idea is that the E source was also written by a priest, but not an Aaronid priest. A priest from the Shiloh tabernacle. And there's different reasons that are given in who wrote the Bible as to why that is believed to be the case. And it's even thought that the D source may actually be written by a priest as well. But that's not known for sure. But, yeah.
Well, how many people knew how to write back then?
Yeah, that's a good question. There probably were not that many people. But there is evidence from certain archaeological sites, Israelite sites, of like people practicing their alphabets and stuff. But there is a big difference between knowing how to write your name and writing a complex narrative like we have here. And so generally speaking, what historians would say is that it was probably in the whole period of ancient Israel, mostly the priests and scribes of the royal palace who could read and write.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, the idea of the documentary hypothesis has three of the primary sources being written by people who are at least likely priests, definitely the P source, and then the J source written by someone connected with the royal palace.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the end of our comparison. Are there any comments or questions?
I'm not 100% sure, but it seems to me like the P source is maybe the most popular one that's followed by more people. And it's also interesting, like when you go to church, a Seventh Adventist church especially, it's what I'm thinking of, that when you study it out, that's usually the way they always mention the plagues, and they mention Pharaoh's heart being hardened. So that actually is, they just take a little bit here and there, but they always tell the story that the sea was parted and the water covered the chariots. And it was always my favorite version of it anyway. I'm not even sure I was aware that one of the versions says they were tossed into the sea. So it's extremely neat, for lack of a better word right now, that we're aware of this now. But there's all these different tellings. And, yeah. And we still have yet to go through some others, correct? Isn't there one other that we haven't covered yet? Is it the B as in boy or D as in dog source? I can't remember.
D as in dog.
Like Deuteronomy.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it would be.
But
okay.
that source does not narrate the Exodus story like this does. I think in the D source, there's Deuteronomy 32 has a poem that's attributed to Moses that tells something kind of like an Exodus story, or at least wilderness wandering, but it's not like another source of this same thing. So it's really just these three sources that tell this story in a similar way to each other. I actually find it very interesting how similar this is to New Testament gospel studies, because there's four primary sources of the Pentateuch. There are four canonical gospels. In the gospels, the three first ones, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are actually very similar to each other and related literarily. And they just tell the story more similar. And then John, the last one, the fourth one, is kind of stand on its own. It's still similar, but it's totally different as compared to the others. That's actually very much so the same as the documentary hypothesis, where you have the first three sources, J, E, and P, and they tell the same basic story. They go from the patriarchal period or even before up until the time of Moses, and they have more similarity in their telling of things. And then the last source is kind of the odd one out, D, Deuteronomy, and it's more so dealing with not so much just the history of what happened, but dealing with the message, the theology, and all of that. Same thing, John is typically viewed as not so much dealing with just the telling of Jesus' life, but dealing with his teachings, the theology. So I don't know how that ends up happening, if that's just coincidence or what, but it's just an interesting similarity.
the sources, I'm sure, have, some either religious or political slant to them, They're trying to make some kind of a point or whatever. And isn't the Deuteronomy source was probably the last of these, like there was the J, the E, the P, and the Deuteronomy source was like post-Second Temple, right? Well, they think that. I mean, obviously there's no way to know that for sure, but they think that there's archaeological evidence that was written later.
Well, it's actually quite interesting. Traditionally, the documentary hypothesis, as first proposed by, I believe his name was Wellhausen, who first kind of tied the idea of the four sources together, I believe that he thought, and I think many scholars have since then, that the P source was actually the last written. And so sometimes you'll see the sources written out as JEDP, and then other times as JEPD. So the D and the P are flipped around sometimes depending on the scholar and whichever one they think was written first. Richard Elliott Friedman argues that the D source was the last written, that P came first. So you have J, then E, then P, then D. And he argues that all of them were actually written before the destruction of the temple. So all of them in First Temple times. And his arguments for that include linguistic arguments, saying that all of the sources, including P and including D, do come from a time of biblical Hebrew prior to the Second Temple period. So the phase of the Hebrew language that they were written in was pre-Babylonian, pre-exilic, in other words, pre-exilic Hebrew, and that the Hebrew of D is actually later than the Hebrew of P, not by much. But, these are the sorts of arguments, though, that historians have who do believe the documentary hypothesis, but they have different understandings of exactly how it came about. And just because, the ones that we are recommending in terms of the books happen to say it's J, E, P, and then D, and all of that is pre-exilic, does not necessarily mean that for sure is the case. Though I will say that Richard Elliott Friedman's understanding of the documentary hypothesis has certainly become dominant, because he's argued very, very well in favor of his understanding of it and provided good evidence. That a lot of people have been convinced by that, though there are certainly differing opinions. So I haven't studied it well enough, first of all, to confirm all these different sources. It seems quite likely in light of the evidence that I have seen, but I haven't studied it well enough to confirm for sure that the overall hypothesis is true, even though, again, something very much like it must be if it isn't. And then, in getting into more details like, exactly the order of it and all of that, that gets into stuff that I am not yet equipped to evaluate as fully as needs to be. So, yeah. Any other comments or questions? All right, I guess not. Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the meeting, seeing as we've been on for almost 2 hours?
I'll pray. Heavenly Family, we thank you so much for this Feast of Unleavened Bread and for just all the truths that you've shown us really throughout the past year. And I thank you for the new truths that you started us off on for this year. And I thank you for guiding us and leading us into all truth, Sister. You are such a wonderful leader, and we just pray that we would be able to absorb everything that we've learned and share it with others and make it, put it into practice and into effect in our lives, the things, the principles that you teach us. And we ask for a great year, Heavenly Sister, just multiplying the harvest and including ourselves. And we ask this in the name of the branch, he and she, we pray. Amen.
Amen.